Capernaum, where there was a prominent woman, and she urged him to eat a meal there.
Kind of stinky.
As often as he would pass by, he would stop there to eat. So she said to her husband, I know that it is a holy man of God who comes this way regularly. Please, let us make a small room on the roof and put there for him a bed, a table, a chair, and a lampstand. Then whenever he comes to us, he can stay there. So we notice how this initially started. Her faith motivated her to share a meal with Elisha. She recognized the efforts that he was going through, the work that he was doing, how important this was, and her faith motivated her to share a meal with him. Now, even this is something that we can display in our own lives. It's an example that each of us can follow, whether it be with a circuit overseer, with those in our own congregation that perhaps could use assistance. We think about over the last year, the faith that we've displayed in that, following that example during the COVID pandemic, helping one another find resources, things that we needed. If we knew that there were elderly ones that couldn't go out, for instance, we might have gone out of our way to make sure that they had the supplies and the food that they needed to stay taken care of. So similarly, this woman decided out of her faith that she would display this, that she would do this for him. And then we notice in verse 9, she's motivated further. She recognizes that Elisha is a holy man and says that because he comes through there regularly, that she wants to go further in her service. She decides to make a room for him on the roof, to put a table, a chair, a lampstand, and effectively giving him all the things that he would need to stay the night there as he passes through. We think about, for example, in Paul's travels, how he would have done a lot of letter writing. Likely Elisha would have done similar. So she took into consideration his needs. She gave him the things that he would need to stay there, at least temporarily, and even put up an extra bed. Again, an example that we can follow. In the past, we've had instances, for instance, with Hurricane Harvey, where some individuals in our congregation did make space. We even had RVs behind the Kingdom Hall, trying to make good use of the space that we had in order to show hospitality to those that needed it, and to show our appreciation for the efforts they were going through. Now, Elisha recognizes this. He recognizes how this might inconvenience them, how difficult this may have been, or the trials that they may have gone through to get him all of these things. And he appreciates this. So in return, Elisha offers a blessing to this woman and her husband. At first, he goes forward and says, well, I can talk to an army commander. I can talk to the leaders of the land to put you in favor with them. And she says, no, I don't need that. I don't need riches. I don't need anything from you. And Elisha decides to think outside of the box. And when he speaks to a man accompanying him, recognizes that she doesn't have a son, which especially at this time may have been very important. And so Elisha decides out of his own initiative to bless her with a son. He tells her that in a year's time, or actually he doesn't tell her, but in a year's time she does have a son that was given to her by Jehovah. This was something completely unexpected to this woman. Turn to 2 Kings, chapter 4, verse 16 and 17. 2 Kings chapter 4 says, Then he said, At this time next year you will be embracing a son. But she said, No, master, man of the true God, do not tell lies to your servant. However, the woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son at the same time next year, just as Elisha had told you. Now it's interesting to note that this woman's faith in Jehovah, her zeal for this message, for this truth that needed to be carried out, it motivated her to act, and she was rewarded in a way that perhaps she didn't expect. She hadn't considered that this was even a possibility, let alone that it would actually be offered to her by somebody. Now, why is that important? When we act faithfully to Jehovah, when we carry out assignments, when we do our best to be hospitable and to show faith in Jehovah, oftentimes we don't necessarily think about what it is that we're expecting Jehovah to give to us. We're doing it out of zeal, out of excitement, out of passion for Jehovah, for the truth. And yet, in some ways, we oftentimes will find that we have blessings that we never expected, whether it be through strengthening the faith, through the friends in the congregation, but one way or another, we oftentimes will find that we get a blessing that we didn't see coming. Now, after this woman has this child, she experiences something that she obviously wasn't expecting. In 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 32 through 37, it says, When Elisha came into the house, the boy was lying dead on his bed. So after a few years of having this child, he was ripped away from her in death, which, whether you perhaps have been through it, or perhaps you've seen others experience it, you can imagine how difficult this must have been to take, how heart-wrenching it must have been for this family, the way this child might have represented hope in some ways for them, and how this was ripped from them. So, obviously, this family is grieving. The mother goes out of her way. She actually seeks out Elisha at one point, and eventually they meet back at his bed. And notice in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 33, it says, he went in and closed the door behind them and began to pray to Jehovah. Then he got up on the bed and lay down on the child and put his own mouth on the boy's mouth, his own eyes on his eyes and his own palms, and kept bent over him, and the child's body started to grow warm. He walked back and forth in the house, and he got up on the bed and bent over him again. The boy sneezed 7 times, after which he opened his eyes. Notice in verse 36, Elisha now called Gehazi and said, call the Shunammite woman. So he called her, and she came in to him. Then he said, pick up your son. And she came in and fell at his feet and bowed down to the ground before him. Afterwards, she picked up her son and went out. Now imagine the amount of faith that she would have had to even consider approaching Elisha for this. She didn't know that she could have a son given to her, let alone that he could be resurrected. This was purely out of faith that she had in Jehovah and in the power that he bestowed through Elisha, the ability that he had given him. But she had no idea if this was going to work. Even still, Jehovah decided to bless her further and resurrect her child. This may have been a very difficult time for her to experience, but it also shows us an interesting example about Jehovah. In Job chapter 14, verse 14 and 15, the song that we sang earlier references this. If a man dies, can he live again? And Jehovah promises that he will call and the dead will answer. In verse 15, it says, you will long for the work of your hands, referring to Jehovah longing to bring back these lost individuals. So what do we learn from the example of the Shunammite woman? Well, first of all, how our faith can motivate us to go forward and be hospitable to others, those in need, whether they be in our own congregation, those that are traveling, but also how our faith can help us and prepare us for the coming resurrection. This, of course, was only a sampling of what Jehovah had promised. And so really, we look forward to this resurrection on a much grander scale. Back to Jim.